It's great to be here. My name is Michael Göbel. I teach history at Freie Universität Berlin, but I'm currently in Buenos Aires, as you would have been able to see in the background had I not shut the curtain, because in that case you wouldn't have seen my face. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and especially delighted to give the introduction to Carl Nightingale and his new book, Earthopolis, which comes out with Cambridge University Press. I'm delighted for a variety of reasons. I consider Carl a friend by now, but also a close colleague with whom I'm working together in a variety of settings, such as the Global Urban History Project, or short GUP, which has been founded in Carl's home city in Philadelphia in 2017. But I'm also delighted because I admire Carl as a scholar and have engaged many times with his prolific work, reread some of the things that he wrote, in particular on segregation, but also read a draft of the book that he's about to present, which I recommend to everybody in the warmest possible terms. I think it's the only book that really covers that much ground of human history from an urban history angle over several millennia, various continents. As the subtitle of the book says, it's really a biography of our urban planet. And it's written by someone who's one of the best known urban historians in the United States today. He's professor of world history at the University at Buffalo, SUNY. And he's known for his writings on Philadelphia, but above all for his 2012 book, which came out with Chicago University Press, called Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, which is a tour de force of the global history of segregation, both in colonial settings and in contemporary settings, which is a book that was published to great acclaim, has been widely read, one of the most frequently cited books in urban history, not only by historians, but also by urban scholars, which is no small feat to get their ear for a historian. So I sympathize with the problem and admire the solution. So for all these reasons, it's great to be here to introduce Carl Nightingale to you. And I don't want to eat more of your time. It's great to be here and have this presentation. Even though I've read the book, I'm excited to hear what he's going to tell us. So thanks so much, Carl, for this. And I hand over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And we will now go through the process of sharing a screen here. Okay, can people see what I have here? I guess you can't tell me, so I'll assume that you can.
Yes.
So this is the cover of this book that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Thanks both to Josh and to Cambridge University Press and to Michael for the chance to talk a little bit about just some of the work that goes into this, just a little bit of the work that goes into this. But to begin with, I'll kind of just I'll kind of do something that I often forced my graduate students to do, which is to take a book, substantial book, and reduce it to a few hundred words. And here are the few hundred words, actually less than a few hundred, just over 100. That kind of give the entire argument in a succinct kind of way. The book argues that we live on Earthopolis, the only urban planet we know of in the universe. Our urban planet is a human creation whose origins date back 6,000 years ago, about halfway through the relatively calm geological period known as the Holocene epoch, when we began designing, building, and inhabiting larger, highly concentrated settlements. There, we'd also concentrate large quantities of energy from the sun and earth into powerful human institutions, including states of many kinds, wealth amassing companies, and centers of knowledge creation. Many periods of creation and destruction followed, but cities proved capable of amplifying humans' power to dominate other humans, other species, and the wide-ranging ecosystems required to sustain cities, with many consequences. Then in three bursts, after 1500, 1780, and 1945, the spatial reach of these variously unequal forms of human power accelerated, along with their underlying urban conditions, the truly planetary dimensions. The urban planet that came into being along the way soon allowed us to threaten the relative calm of the Holocene epoch that made cities possible in the first place. And one big question remains, will cities now help us to survive the consequences of the vastly amplified power they allowed us to wield? They have allowed us to wield on Earth. So there's a little bit, yeah, I guess it's a bit of a spoiler. I should have spoiler alerted you. Gives you kind of the overall thing, how it begins, middle, and end. But as I hope you'll find that the evidence that you need to, and the stories you need to tell about cities that prove these points are themselves, I think, more interesting than the argument itself. That the actual path to that argument is very complicated. And that brings us into just quick thought about the field that Michael and I work in, called global urban history, the field that Michael actually gave the name to, really, and asked whether there's a kind of split personality in that field, which I'm taking one side rather than the other. One of the main goals of global urban history is to diversify the field of urban history, which has been tended to focus heavily on North America and Europe. By calling it global, we mean to encourage research on more of the world's cities, and especially in the global South and before 1850. And in so doing, I mean, what we're doing really is simply, it seems like a pretty straightforward and wise thing to do, since you know, the global South includes basically the most urbanized continent on Earth, that is South America and Latin America region, the fastest accelerating urban continent on Earth, which is Africa, and the continent which has perennially had the largest cities in the world, which is Asia, except for a very small period in global urban history from 1800 to about 1965. So those are one thing. And the other thing is that we're also saying that, you know, by looking at these cities, we're also diversifying the ways in which these places impacted the Earth. Each of these cities did so in different ways, in its own way. And the big part of urban history is just being able to look into cities and to sort of glorify and maybe even celebrate at some level the importance of the local, the power that and the energy that comes out of cities. So there's a lot of the urban history itself, I think, prides itself on being able to bring that to the fore. So then here comes my side, which is a little bit different than that, and may seem to also kind of, in some ways, go against this other thing, which is to synthesize things, to analyze cities as creations and creators of larger scale and even global historical phenomena. And I think there's a concern among those especially focused on diversification that these kinds of stories will in some ways erase the smaller stories, that they'll kind of homogenize those stories. And so what I think what I wanted to do, especially in this book, was to try to bring the two together, to think about an urban planet that is something that's big and it's single. It's the only one we know of in the universe, as something that is inherently and only can exist because of its diversity, its plurality, its multifariousness. And I'm helped along by the fact that in telling this story, it begins with many birthplaces and many birthdays. And we'll get to that in a little bit as we go along. But the fact is that the cities we know grew up in dozens of different places almost independently, in many places over many centuries and millennia, even during the first 5,500 years of cities' existence. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we tend to have a split personality about cities just in general. We have much celebration, especially going on now of cities. People are moving into them in greater numbers than ever before. There's more of us in cities than not. And yet there's also these the old anti-urban feelings that have gone on and that have also reemerged, especially because it seems like cities are creating most of our pollution, most of our global warming, and so on. And so what I hope to do with the urban idea of the urban planet is to really embrace what I call the ambiguities of our bargain with city amplified power. And in so doing, I'm going to use the word our and we and us quite often. And this also gives some scholars hives because it seems to think that to blame all of humanity for the problems that only some of us are creating, it also can have a tendency to again to homogenize us. But I'm going to use it with a fully another sense of we, which is something that brings together those of us who are diverse. So, and we can talk about that question of we in greater detail later if you'd like. But what I do first is to do something which to kind of give us to give us a real sense of to dive right into a big city, and I'm going to do that by showing you some slides from one of the most amazing I think one of the most amazing pieces of evidence from a city. And we're going to go not only into we're going to leave North America, Europe behind. This is China, as you can probably guess. But it's also going way back. This document is nearly 900 years old. It's called it's a scroll, a silk scroll. It's called Along the River During the Qingming Festival. Dates from the 12th century, and it was often interpreted to be the city of Kaifeng, which you may not have heard of very often, but which was a very important capital, and it reappears in the book very often. It turns out that in fact, this scroll, which is a wonderful look into urban life of this time, is neither Kaifeng, because there's no sign at all that any of the monuments or the buildings are part of Kaifeng, nor is it really the Qingming Festival. And that's too bad, because here we are at the Cambridge Festival. It'd be nice to have the Qingming Festival alongside it. Both of them are in spring and so on and so forth. But the Qingming Festival would be, you would see lots of people with brooms going out to the cemeteries to clean up the graves of their ancestors. And there's just very little of that going on here. What instead we have, I think, is really a celebration of cityness itself. That happens to tell us a lot about the capital Kaifeng of the Tang Dynasty in the early 1100s, and also just about what its city is like. But the fact that it's an idealized city also gives us a little bit of things to play with. And here we are coming into the center of town now. Most of the city is to the top, above the actual scroll, but you can see some stuff going along the river, which is a really important part of my arguments as well. You'll see as we go along. I'm just going to keep on going. We're getting now to the places where the city thins out into the rice paddies and grain fields around Kaifeng, and eventually out into the village areas and beyond. And so it trails off. So just to, this thing, gives us, I think, a lot of the, reminds us a lot of the appeal of urban history in general, that it allows us to plunge into the densities of a city's life, to travel over time and place, to engage in the kind of sense of cities that they bless us as social beings. This is us as our most social. This is where we come together in the herd or the flock or the group. There's a lot of diversity, juxtaposition, a lot of serendipity that's going on here. Excitement about sociability. Here we are with the restaurants and cafes that all of us, I think, love about cities, and even a sense of the city that just never sleeps. And in fact, there's a contemporary description of Kaifeng that basically says this, that even when it rains or snows heavily, there are salted beans with ginger, fried entrails, fried liver, crabs, walnuts, pears, pomegranates, hawthorn fruit, steamed rice cakes, and bean soup. Tea sellers arrive by the third watch to serve those who've been delayed past midnight. Truly, these booming markets of Kaifeng have turned the city night into day. So here we have a very early vision of the city that never sleeps. And this is what this is, really. There's also questions of anonymity. We're in this place, we don't know most of the people we see. There's excitement, as I say, about commerce and delight in shopping. We have a sense that cities themselves are kind of a commodity, a place we would want to go to, travel to, not only over space like we do in so many millions of us as tourists, but in time. And that's something I think urban historians like to think of themselves as the tour guides of cities in past as well. There's also a sense of cities as places where technological advance, of scholarship. There are scholars in amidst all of these, and we'll visit them shortly, and knowledge. And in Kaifeng, in fact, figures so often in the book just because there's so many technological advances that happened during this period that had later implications. There's also maybe a sense, to use the title of a recent book, that cities always make us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. Maybe a sense also that of city politics is more complex, but also, we know of cities as nowadays as having more progressive politics. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of evidence of that in this scroll, but there's also evidence of a couple other things that are much more ambiguous, and also that are not local, so to speak. They come from the city itself. They're bigger than the city itself, and they remind us that cities, in fact, don't exist solely in the local space. For example, here are some people gathering water from a well. Now, cities. Part of the problem with cities is that they are small, relatively small spaces. They're concentrated, and there's lots and lots of people, including many thirsty people. There's just not enough water under the city to feed, usually to give enough to all to provide enough for all the people in the city. So you have to go somewhere else for that water as well, outside. Similarly, all this food that we're seeing served here cannot be grown or raised in a city. You see the carts bringing it in, carts over here bringing in food, people over here carrying stuff in on poles. Here, some bigger cars. These would be the kind of the lorries or the trucks of the day, or here the big heavy laden grain ships that you can see being unloaded over here onto the docks. Similarly, we can see that this is where this all comes from, the grain, and it's just clear that there's not going to be enough fields here in the city itself to be able to grow those, even though urban agriculture is a big part of city life from way back. There's also the people. The people come from far away too, and here they are streaming into cities. Many of the inhabitants of most cities are immigrants. Then there's the building materials. Here's a construction site. Those building materials cannot be, in this case, wood and other kinds of building materials cannot be fully sourced within the limits of the city. It has to come from somewhere else. So what we need to do here is to think of the urban condition as something that has a bigger dimensions than the cities itself. And the part that we know the best, I think, is urban hinterlands. And I'm thinking a lot about urban hinterlands. I think urban historians need to think more about them too. These things, first of all, I divided into these hinterlands into thin, very small, dispersed habitats, thread-like structures or infrastructures that bring stuff to the city, and then thick. So we're going to go over. We're going to start with thin, move to thread-like and thick, and then figure out how these things all work together. So then, basically most of the cities supply basic stuff for life has to come from somewhere else. And most of those places are thinly dispersed over large surfaces of the earth. They include farms and villages, forests, estates, plantations, camps of foragers and nomads. All those animals had to be raised somewhere else, usually to start with. Certainly domesticated animals were domesticated in very small camps dispersed across the continents. Things like mines to heat a city like Kaifeng, which has a cold winter. You need fuel from somewhere. All the industry and all that hustle and bustle needs to be fueled as well. And then the building materials and other raw materials. So that's really important. But to really clarify exactly what kind of hinterland we're talking about, it's really a planetary hinterland. We're talking about these thin human habitats where we can get these things are fueled in turn from a planetary hinterland, starting with the sun that sends all kinds of energy across 100 and some million kilometers to the Earth, where it is processed by the atmosphere, then brought in various different quantities across the Earth to various different places, and including the thin urban hinterlands and then into the cities. So that's an important thing. I think one thing we need to know is that before we had an urban planet, we had planetary cities. All cities are planetary. They all exist on a planet. They are made of a planet, and they exist at the mercy of a planet. In particular, the cities came up during a particular time during this, in the last 11,700 years, known as the Holocene period, when the very, very widely gyrating temperatures of the previous period, million plus years of the Pleistocene, evened out a little bit, and we had a much more even temperature variations in our climate, and that made those cities, those hinterlands, possible. And most of that geosolar energy that came to cities in its relatively sort of modulated amounts came through rivers, and that's going to be really important. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but note that in the beginning, river valleys were by far the most important way for us to get that energy. Then you have to bring it from these various different but widely dispersed habitats into cities, and this is what infrastructures are all about. These are designed differently than the energy gathering hinterlands. And by the way, those hinterlands are very varied. There's many different ones. The mines are different from the places where we get grain, which is different from where we get leather to make certain kinds of things, different where we get wood planks or beams and so on. Every one of those is very diverse. Those are very diverse places. So bringing back the question of diversity into the whole story. So then there's a very different kind of human habitat. It is a human habitat. People live in it. Smaller numbers of people live in it, and they tend to live in vehicles or on animals throughout urban history. And these are much larger structures, but they're elongated. They're tentacular. They spread out like this, and they're nodal. They tend to move towards central places. These include things like the nodes include the tentacles include rows, and the nodes include inns, like we saw in the picture. Water routes and harbors are just sort of some examples of early thread-like or infrastructural parts of these habitats. That brings us to thick, because these thin and thread-like habitats are absolutely essential to any kind of habitat that is enlarged or concentrated. And enlargement and concentration turn out to be extremely important to understanding, what a city is and what it can do for us. This slide, I'm going to pull it out just a little bit here so you can see. Okay, so when we enlarge and concentrate buildings and built area and our populations, and we bring in lots of animals, what we're doing is essentially we're changing we're quite radically changing the shape of the habitat. And I put this blue line on the bottom. This is kind of maybe the baseline for a village. You can think of this whole grid here as a kind of soundboard that where the sound person who is taking care of a concert, say, we'll call it the concert of cities, is moving up various different pieces of the sound to higher levels. And in all cases, these are higher levels than they would be in a village or town. You have to have all these ingredients to have a city. So we know that about cities, that they have these ingredients. But we don't know, we can't really say for sure that a city must have certain volume of these. That's something we can't do. And we can't say that a certain volume, a certain recipe of certain, exact volume. Every city has does this a little bit differently in a different order. And then the interactions between these things also are unpredictable, so impossible to really fully define. But we know they need to increase. And as we do, we enlarge and concentrate buildings, built areas, populations, animals. We're bringing in more and more energy. We're bringing in more food. We're bringing in more water. We're bringing in all the things we need, building materials and so on that come from the hinterlands. We're building up reservoirs of more energy. In the process, we're tending to also nucleate these settlements more. That is, bring one part of the city into a greater, more dense space, create more density there, and also more importance for the city as a whole and other neighborhoods. We tend to break cities up a lot more, our settlements up. We tend to also put some kind of boundary around them, although here, I'm going to keep that, you can see that's a little bit lower, because even though we put walls around many, many cities, we don't do that so much anymore. And the boundedness has gotten a lot more complicated of a task for us. What happens when you concentrate? Almost absolutely predictably, you're going to get more diverse people, more diverse buildings, more diverse activities. You're going to specialize. People are going to be no longer just farming or just mining or just cutting down wood. They're going to be putting things together and doing other kinds of activities, selling, buying, and so on, living lives of the mind, getting involved in politics. There's going to be many more interactions and much more frequent and much cheaper interactions, because you don't have to go so far. So the transport costs for meeting up with other people is lower. Those are going to be more anonymous. You're going to meet more people who you don't know. That's going to also generate networks and alliances, but it's also going to generate many more conflicts. This is just creating more energy that requires higher and higher capacity, or creates higher and higher capacity, what I call political communities, social movements, and governing institutions. So all those things come out of doing that kind of concentrating. We can pretty much predict that that's going to happen, and that what we're going to do is we're going to pull energy in, and we're going to put human power out. We're going to start to act, be able to act outward from a city back out into wider spaces. And it's this part that I think is most important to understanding Earthopolis and the whole concept of an urban planet, because it is the place where the most diverse core of our habitat also becomes the most powerful, and therefore, and by definition, is about us human beings deploying that power over space, wider spaces, and over larger periods of time. Now, of course, diversity's evil twin also emerges in this, in the process of inequality, because these governing institutions don't necessarily include all people, networks and alliances and so on and so forth, and the conflicts are winners and losers in all of those. So even though we've had plenty of inequality in non-urban places, there are new kinds of inequality that come out of living in cities. So where can we see that in our deep urban exploration of cities? Well, one thing is fortifications, and this one here in the sort of idealized version of the city is a bit of a beautiful monument, but in fact these are weapons of war. Chinese cities had the world's widest, thickest walls. They were made only by impressing tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of workers to pound the local ground, that is the soil called loess, from this, in this case, the valley of the Biang River, into gigantic earthworks that are then clad in stone and brick. These things were meant as defensive things against other armies, but it was also meant to awe other forces. So there's no question about that, that cities also were places where we gathered all this energy, and we put it into institutions that were meant to handle, commit acts of violence on large scales. And so also we created bureaucracies, and here this is probably a person studying to become part of the bureaucracy in the Chinese state. He's memorizing the works of Confucius in order to pass exams in the Chinese system. That the Song system, they would then take on offices that would help the state to manage its violence, but also to fund it by raising taxes. You can see also that there's a lot of artisanal work, and this artisanal work could be technologically advancing and so on and so forth. It also could be technological advances, can do all kinds of things. These wagon wheel makers could be making wagon wheels for the army, as well as they could be for commerce. And we know that Kaifeng, for example, was a very, very important early center of gunpowder making as well. So these artisanal shops were connected to the state, the needs of the state. Then there were also companies of very wealthy people who traded goods from even further away. And here we have some caravan merchants who are coming in from possibly from the far west from Kaifeng over the deserts through the famous Silk Road, bringing luxuries that are from far away, that by definition of them being far away were also more expensive and more desired by locals. And you can see that those things also are combined with some new kinds of urban inequalities. You can see these wealthy people driving around in their basically their limousines, their fancy cars, in this case sedan chairs, moved along by 4 and 5 different servants and their employee. There's also gender inequalities. This one here contains a woman who's kind of a little more segregated from the rest of the mostly male crowd in these streets. And then there's the ordinary porters and laborers and peasants. So those signs of inequality are really important to remember, fundamentally important parts. Then there's also the question of knowledge creation. Here we have a temple where various different rites are being performed that are often brought into state ideologies. But but in general, cities are places of learning. Here's a group of scholars who are also teaching a kid how to walk, and there's a sort of sense of a school going on here. Here's a bunch of bohemians, scholars, young scholars, contemplating the universe on the bridge, and creating new knowledges and so on that can be moved outward from cities. So I think one thing that's maybe a little bit more that urban historians need to think a lot more about is what I call urban forelands. That is, spaces outside the city that are occupied by city amplified deployments of human power. And the state is an obvious early example of how we would do, not only early, but persistent all the way through. It turns out that states are very complicated to define, just as our cities, and there are institutions before there were any cities that had plenty of attributes we might associate with states. There were also cities that had governing institutions that had very few of those attributes. However, over time, it's clear that states became increasingly addicted to the power that they could gather in cities, and that cities themselves took form increasingly from their relationship to states, and in particular, when the power that gathered in those states was able to spread really wide and be deployed over very wide areas across to other cities, to other hinterlands, then they became empires. And we can see that basically all of the kinds of the basic forms of human power can be taken from a city and imposed or pushed out from a city across large areas. The capacity, institutional capacity of administering, taxing, raising armies, those so forth, so the ability to organize armed forces into effective weapons, the use of ideology, of personal charisma, of wealth accumulation. All of this is something that the state was heavily involved in. Technological knowledge, in terms of moving and circulating goods and so on, in terms of trying to reproduce human beings, making lives longer, and the use of built structures, palaces, offices, barracks, walls, weapons shops, ports, temples, universities, etc. All of these things have a long histories in cities, and they ultimately don't work in the way, they don't work in the kind of when they are in cities, that these all are phenomena that help to expand power. There's also a use of cities in hierarchies, and I'm going to go to another Chinese dynasty. This is from an earlier golden age, the Tang Dynasty, whose capital was not at Kaifeng, but at Chang'an. And you can see here one of the ways that this empire used its capital and cities in general to spread its power was to create urban hierarchies. And in Chinese terminologies of cities, there's a hierarchy even within the names. Now the word Chang'an doesn't have this, but many of the capitals end in the words Jing, like Beijing. Kaifeng was also known as Bianjing. Here it has a different last syllable, Zhao, which is more of a sub-capital or a prefectural capital. And then there's smaller cities that aren't on this map that are called Shengs, that are more which means essentially walled settlements that are county seats. So building cities that are in hierarchies that are aligned with the will that is being the powers that are being pushed by the capital outward is extremely important. And you can see in this next, as we zoom in here, just how important capitals are to this kind of thing. You can see this imperial city area, so just underneath the palace where the emperor is, south of where the palace of the emperor is. All kinds of things. There's military stuff here. There's the Department of State Affairs. There's the granaries. These are where the tax money is coming in, the tax drained, animals and fodder taken care of, various different religious affairs, diplomatic affairs, making sacrifices, more religious affairs, and navigation, taking care of the court over here. Directory of arms, of course, so the weapons are there, and then this whole thing is surrounded by a wall, and it's really important that you can see how the state is protecting itself and also building its own power, and that's kind of an ambiguity that I think is really important. That every city is a power center, creates power, but it's also vulnerable to counter power. Exercises of power, and one of those happens within the city itself. That cities are big places and they have lots of people, and those people can, decide that they don't like the sovereign. And this is something that we're seeing more and more. The question of just how much power a state could impose upon its people. We used to think of the early cities in particular as being mostly very authoritarian. Archaeologists are starting to see that there's signs of a lot more give and take And there's one Tang sovereign who famously put this whole question in kind of nice terms that fits very well to some of the other themes in this book, where he said the sovereign is the boat and the people the water. The water may keep the boat afloat, but it can overturn it. This is from the 8th century, long before the age of revolutions. But there's a kind of implication that these kinds of things could happen, and we know from Athenian democracy, Roman democracy, and from many other cities in the Americas actually during this time too, that there were times when the sovereign was toppled many times, in fact. And then it wasn't just from within the city that these kinds of threats could come. Peasants could rebel. Peasants were by far the largest number of people. They could rebel, and they often did in China. And then China had this particular problem with nomadic peoples from really dispersed, very small, movable camps in the Central Asian steppes, who could, especially when cities began to grow up in China, they began to figure out ways of gathering together and of using horses, which they herded and which they knew how to ride much better than people in cities, to storm cities and make off with the loot. So there were cities' power and urban hierarchies were really important, and they existed for long periods during big chunks of cities, but big chunks of history. But they were not necessarily absolute hierarchies. They could be toppled over time, and that's a really important part of this. Nonetheless, over time, my sense is that we have to still think about these outward projections of human power that cities allow us to deploy, and we also have to ask, how do we know what exactly happens when these things occur? And one area to look for that is what I call realms of action. So spaces that are taken up by the actions that we can take from cities and can't necessarily take from other smaller habitats. These include empire, and they include large-scale commerce that was very difficult to keep regular in smaller zones, and that also allowed us to expand the amount of goods that were moved around. Also, cities were really required to create the first currencies, because states, because currency was a function of state and also a function of large-scale commerce. So those are some of the things. Other realms of action include, the expansion of knowledge communities over wide areas. Small cults could become large, regional and then even global religions, communities of knowledge, secular knowledge, and then later on, things like consumer cultures, all required cities. And these are all what I call realms of action. The other thing is that cities expanded the habitat beyond cities as well. The bigger cities got, the more habitat we needed to build. And so that's one place in which the thin and thread-like habitats also grew as cities grew. That also meant that we were impacting things beyond our, species beyond our, and spaces beyond our reach, and faced consequences. So, cities not only brought in other words, energy, but they allowed us to export power and powerful actions out into further. And ultimately, that meant that we were creating hierarchies. Sorry, just jumped ahead too much there. Of thick over thin and thread-like that were pretty persistent, not always, but pretty persistent all the way through. And that's why we call this urban. I call them urban forelands as opposed to like village forelands or infrastructural forelands. These are forelands that were created because of the power we had in cities, and that could even go out to affect the relationship, the energy creating relationship between the sun and earth, in particular through the rivers that brought most of this energy into the early cities. This is another scroll from another time. This is much later, the Tang Dynasty in the 18th century, but it gives you a really great sense of how important how cities could then have impact on these on rivers themselves, even the same river that gave them brought their energy in the first place. So this river, as you see, is not blue. It's kind of a brownish yellow. This is the yellow river, the Huanghe, and it carries in lots and lots of not only water but huge amounts of silt, and this very fine-grained silt or soil called loess. And partly it's getting yellower and yellower because these forests that are on the hills now have retreated in favor of agriculture and rice production to some degree and wheat production that's going to go into the city. You can see a city here, probably a county seat coming into being over here. But you can also see that as the loess increases because the forest no longer holds it back, there are more likely to be floods because during the rainy season it flows fine, but when it stops raining, then it settles to the bottom and the river effectively rises and overflows its banks. And you can see that the built environment has had to deal with this. To keep big cities like Chang'an or Kaifeng in place and fed, we need to build walls all along the river, these dikes all the way along the river to keep it from flooding. And it doesn't always work, as you can see over here, where a flood is kind of inundated a big area. And that often happened in cities too. Now, there's ways of using this flooding to support cities. For example, going back to the 12th century in Kaifeng, an emperor actually broke down the dikes in order to keep a nomadic people or a smaller scale state from a group of people from taking over Kaifeng, the Jurshen. They flooded the river and created a big, huge area where they couldn't move their horses. You may notice that same thing happened in Ukraine just over the last month when the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian military has opened up the dikes north of Kyiv to try to stop Russian tanks. That same kind of thing was going on here too. But in general, the state of the river was a sign of the consequences of city building, and often could bring disaster. So those are just some little pieces of how all this happens and what these realms of consequence. So here's a good example of the most dramatic moment in the entire scroll is this boat that's trying to dock and finding the river too strong to manage. So we get these interplays between energy coming in, power going out, and that's the sort of dynamic that I find is central to understanding what we can call not only urban forelands and urban hinterlands, but an urban planet. So the book is divided into 3 parts, and I'm going to try to I'll go over them just very, very quickly now. That the first basically 5,500 years is covered under the part called the cities of the rivers. This is when cities mostly grew up along rivers. Some did not. For example, the Maya grew up in areas where there were not very many rivers, but where you could catch rainwater in cisterns and sinkholes and wetlands, for example. There's other good examples of this too. But in general, the most powerful cities were ones that derived their geosolar energy from the evaporation of seawater onto the mountains and into rivers that carried silt and nutrients enough for feeding and giving water to cities. And during that time, there were many. The use of rivers was not quite enough. Was enough to do gigantic things, including some of the great early empires, including connecting various different parts of the original birth worlds together. And the basic story is that cities arose in many separate birth worlds. These circles are some examples of them. And energy harvested largely in river valleys allowed dozens of imperial states and other institutions, including mercantile companies and so on and so forth, to deploy regional and even multi-continental surges of human activity and habitat building. And this is the first time that we might have also had some planetary impact, because some of the industries that were essential to these empires also created the first global plumes of pollutants. We find pollutants from China and Rome, for example, in the Greenland ice sheets. And the rice growing in China may have created a situation where huge increasing pollution by methane from rice paddies may have also helped to actually stabilize a little bit the climate by creating a little bit more greenhouse gas than there would have been otherwise, and may have stabilized the Holocene. So even the Holocene era may have created cities. It may have also been, to some degree, the creation of cities. So some realms of action that were bigger than habitat. Overall, during the first 5,500 years, we increased in our population. There was 400 million people, probably by 1500, but there was a very much up and down kind of thing. The other consequence of building a city is that you can domesticate bacteria. There were first pan-continental pandemics of disease that brought the population down. There was warfare could destroy cities as well as create them, and so on. So lots of ups and downs during that first time. And now just quickly, I'll go to show that the rest of the story is compressed into this very, very small period of time, which I call the cities of the world ocean and the cities of hydrocarbon. And the cities of hydrocarbon then is divided into two smaller bursts, one of an acceleration of the industrial period, and then the greatest acceleration, which has happened really since in the last 70 years. Just quickly to give you a sense of these, once we discovered that the world ocean was connected, we opened up a huge new energy hinterland for city building that enabled truly planetary deployments of human power, and based in gunpowder imperial capitals, thanks to some of the technological advances from Chinese cities, the first planetary commercial circuits, the first global capitalist financial centers, enormous thefts of land, labor, and raw materials, expansion of faith communities, and knowledge, planet-wide acts of knowledge acquisition, and the first signs of a first global consumer culture. But during this time also, our realms of action definitely increased. Our realms of habitat also grew dramatically, and our impact also grew now on the ocean itself. The consequences we faced were some of the first global pandemic, among other things, and warfare on a larger scale than ever before. They created its own issues. So that's that story. The hydrocarbon story is probably most familiar to us as readers of urban history or as practitioners. That this oceanic wealth, I trace how the oceanic wealth created new incentives for more use of hydrocarbon in Great Britain, although hydrocarbon was used in places like Kaifeng many centuries earlier. There's a kind of mystery that we have to resolve why in Great Britain it led to the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution and later the factory system. And then tensions in that urban and plantation imperial system, especially in the Atlantic world, fired up big popular revolutions and expand the idea of people power, that is, states accountable to their citizens. Unfortunately, imperialism proved compatible with revolutionary states and industrial power. amassed in new weapons cities, and huge corporations allowed Europe and North American settler colonies to conduct a global conquest, as well as increasing and dramatic acceleration in the size of cities in Europe, North America, and then later Japan, as well as another number of other cities across the world. The number of cities all across the world. And finally, the greatest acceleration, the one we're living in today, you can see thick, thin, and thread-like, covering the globe entirely, though in an unequal way that was set by the earlier acceleration and imperialism. And so the question I think what faces us now is what's next, and can what exactly is the condition of Earthopolis? And I have some pictures of hope to leave us with. This on the left here are pictures from my city of Buffalo, where a group I've been working with for a long time is trying to take the entire west side of the city off of petroleum. Just getting going, but long way to go. But it's been quite a great project. And then, you know, in general, cities are places where we can build political power, not just state political power, but counter-state political power or counter-corporate political power. Here's two images from recent years, of gigantic protests in the streets that only possible really in big cities, in Hong Kong, and then in the very far edges of the urban planet in Port Louis, Mauritius, where an oil spill upended the local economy. So we're left, I think, with a real kind of, one of the things about urban planetary life is that it's existentially ambiguous, where on the one hand, the cities give us the power to change. On the other hand, they also put us in the position of having expanded our realms of action, habitat, and impact, that so much that we're facing the possible consequence of its entirety, of its end, essentially. So I'll leave you with the existential ambiguity, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, for this tour de force of so many millennia and continents, like the book. Mm-hmm. Though you told it all through this one image, which I found especially fascinating and appealing. It obviously has more of an environmental focus than your earlier work, which I find interesting and instructive. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, but I'm sure there's so many issues and topics that you touched upon that there's plenty of questions. I think in order to be able to see the Q&A, you may have to shut down your presentation, Carl.
Okay,
sure. No, I just clicked on Q&A. I currently don't see any open questions, but I may be missing something because I'm unfamiliar with the Q&A button. Josh, can you see any questions, or are there none at the moment?
Yeah, so it doesn't look like we have any open at the moment. So if anyone wants to jump into the Q&A pane, you're more than welcome to ask a question. But Carl, I did also have one, if you don't mind, just sort of based on the presentation. You know, you touched on, and I know you touched on in the book, on how we need to sort of harness the power of cities in the future, and you know that a lot around climate change and these sorts of things. You know, how does that sort of balance with? You also touched on sort of this idea of segregation that cities can often sort of play a role in. So how does that sort of balance with the increasing importance of cities sort of as we move into the future?
Yeah, I think one of the things I argued in segregation is that dividing cities, you know, tends to diminish their capacity to be places of greater equality and welcomingness, obviously, maybe obviously, that tends to cut into the the capacity of cities to do the good things that they do. That keeps them from circulating well, keeps them from building, from spreading knowledge, wealth, and power. So in general, anytime you segregate a city, it's almost always segregation involves some kind of level of also some coercion. Even in so-called zones of voluntary segregation, there are questions about what exactly the choices are available to people. So in general, segregation is a sign of a sick city, a city that's not able to help out as much with the kinds of things that we're going to need cities to be able to do in order to solve bigger problems, such as the crises that we face right now in the 21st century.
I now have a question from Rosemary Wakeman. Hi, Rosemary. She writes, "Thank you, Carl. Your emphasis is on planetary urban ecology and power. Can you explain where urban culture fits in, other than as a mechanism for technology and expansive power?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I think urban culture suffuses the story that I want to tell, and in many different ways. Yeah, it's. I think we need to understand that it's true that ideas can be harnessed by states in the form of propaganda, and they can be harnessed by corporations in the form of propaganda, advertising, other kinds of things, but that ideas also matter more broadly to the political energy of a city, including its capacity to create more equitable forms of political action that I'm convinced are essential to any kind of solution to our existential questions of today. And in general too, I mean, what I try to show is as we go along is that cultural innovation in cities is both a result of the movement that they allow from outside, as well as the movement that they allow from the city outward. And circulation, in other words, of ideas is really an important part of the whole story that colors every aspect of the ecological and the political side of things too. Thanks for the question.
I think that's. Oh, sorry, Michael. Go ahead.
I can't currently see another open question, so maybe I add one or two of my own. The first one had to do with this word planetary, of which you had a short explanation at some point, in which I think you said you speak of planetary conditions because cities are on a planet, and I can't recall the exact formulation. Anyway, the question is, there's of course also this book about planetary urbanization, right? By Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt. Can you explain something about how you relate to this? And I know you do. It seems that you're using the term planetary in a very different way from how they are using it, but I'd be keen to hear more on this. And my other question had to do with inequality. And I think the question is born out of my inability to imagine a non-urban world, right? But at some point you said cities generate their own way of inequality, and that obviously depends on what exactly we mean by inequality. But I struggle to imagine the generation of inequality without cities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'd be interested in hearing something, your thoughts on this sort of counterfactual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a interesting, very interesting question. And let me just back up with the planetary urbanization. So I'm working on a kind of general sort of theoretical gloss on the book, because I didn't want to bring a lot of theory into the book itself. But I'm working on that right now and almost got it done. Sort of thinking about this question of planetary urbanization, how my conception of urban planet as a historical phenomenon is different from that. And one of the things is that planetary urbanization starts in a theoretical framework set up by Henri Lefebvre and others that posits urbanization as a function of capitalist urbanization. That's also very focused on fairly recent phenomena. And so what I'm trying to do is substitute this idea of energy in, power out, as a kind of central dynamic in defining the urban and where urban power comes from and where it goes. So that's the one sort of simple way of beginning that. There are a bunch of different things that follow from that. As far as inequality, this book is coming out about 6 months after another big book on human origins and the human condition called The Dawn of Everything, in which the authors, among other things, argue that the difference between scales of human habitat may not be as big as we think, and this is something I argue against, because the nature of societies was actually very varied in non-urban, pre-urban settings, and maybe as varied in pre-urban settings as it is in urban ones. And furthermore, there were states in pre-urban, or things that came close enough to be called states in pre-urban societies as there was states in post in urbanized areas as well. That there's just as much variety in our political life before and after the arrival of urban. My basic counter to this argument is that that's true. That there were these, and archaeology is moving rapidly in that same direction. That there's a whole of the sort of heterogeneity of human institutions, including very, very unequal relationships, including slavery, including, of course, patriarchy, including all kinds of other class relationships that were very exploitative before cities arrived. But there's something about the sheer quantity of energy brought into cities and the sheer quantity of institutional power that was able that cities were able to enable us to use, that it seems to me is of a different quantity. You're asking about quality, and I think that's a much more interesting and complicated example, but it's a question to think about. But it feels to me like the institutions that were enabled by cities, these more powerful institutions, also just create much more complexity and also more capacity to build authoritarian institutions that can exist over longer periods of time and exert power over bigger spaces, but also counter power within cities too, that could at times alleviate some inequality of power, resources, and learning. To get back to Rosemary's question about culture.
Here's another question from Rosemary. Carl, Where do large-scale migratory flows fit into settlement patterns globally? I'm thinking of early Asian migration to Europe, or as a result of the Little Ice Age or major environmental crises. Where do these fit into the ideas of cities of rivers, oceans?
Yeah. Great question. I don't think that there's way really of dividing migration streams precisely in the same way as the three parts of the book, but they're part of all three. No question about it. That migration streams of various different kinds were probably essential to the earliest cities. We have a number of, and this is really going on very, very slim evidence, but that's being developed as we think about these things. But there are plenty of examples of there are many arguments that early cities were the result of climate refugees or refugees from, say, floods or droughts, who lived in relatively, for example, relatively narrow valleys. When they lived in those narrow valleys, they were more likely to descend onto particular settlements that managed to survive the drought or the flood and fill them up very quickly. So some of these early cities really grew very quickly. So that's one kind of example. Obviously, the cities of the ocean allowed migratory streams to expand dramatically and in size, also across space. And then the industrial period migration, was on yet another level of magnitude, and we're seeing that increase during the greatest acceleration too. The sheer number of people leaving the countryside into cities is immense and unprecedented. So those are all. I think you could say that basically, as cities grew more powerful, they also were able to set in motion larger streams of migratory streams and circuits, and those in turn help to populate cities and increase their size. In almost every chapter, there's a story of cities doing something big, and then those big things impacting the way cities developed during that period. And migration is one of those things.
Here's a question from Lynn Lees, who writes, challenging, exciting model, Carl. Thanks for your presentation. How does your model accommodate urban differences and urban conflict? To follow Graeber and Wengrow, societies have a wider range of choice than historians have generally granted them. Where do you see choice and difference playing a role?
So the one thing I don't think I was able to really convey in the short talk is just how contingent so much of these changes actually is. And in the chapters, I try to do this through talking about plot twists and contingencies and events that seem inexplicable from the point of view of what happened right before, and also in terms of moments when cities expanded, but then brought themselves and their entire empires down through various different consequences of what happened of their expansion. And also, I think one of the key arguments I guess I make all along is that cities are powerful precisely because they're unpredictable. That you don't know exactly what the power that's generated by these very complex political communities is precisely makes contingency maybe more possible. So the fact that Athens democracy is a good example and a great a great cautionary tale too of charismatic rulers who treat with the enemy, then come back and become heroes and despots. That kind of thing is sort of a classic example of that. The Roman Republic being another one with all of its complexities, but our current, knife edge dance between democracy and autocracy feels to me like another period. So it was the 1920s and 30s when we thought we had gigantic leftward movements, but they devolved quickly into fascist ones. And so in a number of really key places, obviously, key cities even. So contingency just seems to me a foundational part of the whole story, and diversity, urban diversity as well. And what I try to do is bring things together in terms of patterns, but also recognize that those patterns are fragile, and that their longevity in time and space is heavily dependent on the diversity and the political conflict and unpredictability that is possible in cities.